Underground Inc., The Rise and Fall of Alternative Rock is a new music documentary directed by Shaun Katz.
It charts the rise of alternative rock in the 90s. Obviously after Nirvana hit the big time, not only did grunge explode across the airwaves, but a lot of alternative rock bands, playing small venues and on small labels. Suddenly the major labels were looking to snap them all up. Anything that sounded, a little bit like Nirvana or a little bit like, sort of alternative rock. But as the title of the documentary suggests, where there's a rise, quite often there's a fall. As soon as record sales start to drop, the labels will drop those bands, unfortunately. And the documentary consists of a number of interviews with members of bands that you may or may not have heard of, depending on what your musical taste, whether you were around in the 90s listening to that sort of music. They're just charting that course from the origins of that sort of sound, and the clubs they used to play and the small gigs and touring in vans and things like that, to then having 6-figure record deals and going on tour all over the world, then getting unceremoniously dumped by their record labels, or engaging in a little bit too much debauchery and drugs and drink. So it's an interesting ride through the ups and downs of being in a rock band in the 90s.
We were kind of invited. We had an email from I think the producers or the distribution company for this documentary, and we get a lot. I think once you put yourself out there, and you have an email address, you suddenly get lots of queries to do reviews for films and whatnot, but we don't do reviews usually. But this one cropped up, and we're both fans of of this kind of music from that period, and I thought, that sounds quite interesting. So I mentioned it to Simon, and we thought, we'll give it a watch and we'll give it a review. I mean, obviously we have done on the channel, we did Hype, the mid-90s film about the Seattle grunge scene and the kind of where that went to, the great heights that the grunge scene and the grunge sound went to, and then where it ended up. And that's a very good documentary. And we did also do Montage of Heck, the Kurt Cobain story as well. So we've kind of done a couple of films similar in that world. And we've done a couple of films, connected musically. I mean, Suburbia, obviously, we did, which is kind of connected to that world as well. I found this documentary to be, it was kind of a good nuts and bolts music documentary. I did find it to be a little bit disjointed at times. I mean, I don't want to be negative on it at all, because it did kind of what it said on the tin. There were some nice bands that cropped up that I wasn't maybe expecting to crop up in a documentary like this. It didn't have the normal types of groups. There were some interesting groups that turned up, but it's kind of an odd one, because it's called Underground Inc., the rise and fall of alternative rock. Now, I mean, alternative rock is interesting because it's kind of a blanket term for so much.
It is, yeah.
So much different types of music that came out, not just the 90s. It kind of started in the kind of late 60s, early 70s. That kind of alternative rock was always kind of alternative to the mainstream. That's why it's called alternative rock. And then, of course, through the 80s, you had a lot of punk and hardcore and post-punk bands and all that kind of stuff going on. But then in the 90s, I mean, alternative rock you could kind of put for, like, in this country you could have Britpop, indie rock, punk rock, post-punk, post-hardcore, industrial rock. There's all these different types of rock music that came out of the 90s, which you could put alternative rock on. In this documentary, however, the majority of bands that they focus on, and they do mention lots of bands going through it, but there's about 3 bands that they kind of focus on, that being Handsome, Cop Shoot Cop, who were kind of, they were kind of industrial rock-esque a little bit, and a couple of other bands were mentioned, but though the bands that were mentioned were kind of closer to kind of hardcore, the punk hardcore scene, and then maybe the industrial rock scene. Fugazi they mentioned, who are another kind of post-hardcore type band. To call it the rise and fall of alternative rock, I found a bit misleading, because I think alternative rock is still there, and it will always be there because it's an alternative to rock music. There was quite a few negative comments in there from bands. There was a big kind of, although they were talking about it coming out of, like, Nirvana obviously starting this and it becoming this, Nirvana making the explosion and all these bands were signed after Nirvana. There was this big kind of backhanded pass to the Seattle sound at one point. They didn't want to talk about the Seattle sound.
No.
okay, fine, you're not so keen on some of those bands, but those bands were huge, and I loved a lot of the music that was in this documentary, and I loved a lot of the Seattle sound as well. Now, obviously, this is subjective. These are my thoughts and my things on these bands, but weirdly, the bands that they covered in this, I personally was never the biggest fan. A Cop Shoot Cop, I listened to a couple of stuff by them. I was never the biggest fan of them. Handsome, that record was okay. Helmet, yeah, I loved Helmet. Big fan of Helmet. Yeah, I don't know. What did you think of it? I mean,
I
you're
would
more-
agree that the sort of go on.
because you're more. I mean, you were very much the Seattle sound growing up.
I was big into grunge. Yeah,
and I know
definitely.
obviously you liked a lot of the kind of the rock music coming out of England as well.
I did, yeah. I liked a lot of Brit rock. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to. One of the thoughts I had after this was like, I'd love to see a similar sort of thing, focusing on British rock bands. Like Terrorvision and Skunk Anansie
Yep.
and Therapy and bands like that. But no, I would agree that alternative rock is a little bit of a wide net to cast, and I kept thinking of bands that I thought, where are they, or why haven't you mentioned them? But the problem is, because it's such a huge range of music, you could never mention everybody. And of course, the documentary maker is only going to be able to, only going to get interviews with people who are going to agree to do it. So, you think about, and obviously it was the rise and fall. So I thought, it would be great to hear from somebody from Faith No More or something like that. But of course, they didn't really have the full. I mean, they split up, obviously, but they never really, I guess they had a peak and then their record sales dropped off a bit. And of course, that sort of scene did die out a bit, but they split up. They didn't have a fall as such. They weren't dropped by the label, I don't think. They had Shaun Katz from White Zombie, and she admits that they didn't really have a bad experience with their major label. It was great as far as they were concerned. But yeah, I mean, I guess it is going to focus on the bands that did have that sort of quick rise, and then that quick fall as well when they didn't sell the records that the record labels wanted them to. There were lots of bands that I remember, but not many that I'd ever listened to. I mean, I think it's turned me into a fan of Corrosion of Conformity. Because were you into them?
Yeah,
Yeah, I thought you were, and I thought, I don't know why, I don't know if I ever listened to it. The thing is, back in the 90s, you couldn't, unless they were, I didn't have MTV, unless they were on, Noisy Mothers, or there was a tape or something on the front of Kerrang that had them on, and it happened to be a song that, clicked with you. You would, the only way you would hear it is if you took a gamble and bought the CD, or you borrowed it off someone. Obviously, I don't know why I never borrowed any off you, but I mean, my taste was sort of changing at that, at that point. I was into the grunge, and then I moved over to sort of Brit rock and Brit pop a bit. Whereas you started to listen to like Pantera and Sepultura, and I went the other way. So I think I probably associated a lot of the bands you did listen to with that sound, thinking that I wouldn't like them, but listening to them, I love Caius now. I didn't like Caius I'd never heard any Caius when they were first around, but I love them now. And Corrosion of Conformity, for me, it's stoner rock, and I'm big into stoner rock.
Corrosion of Conformity, and this won't be a conversation on Corrosion of Conformity, but they are in the documentary. I mean, it was nice to see them, and again, it was also, I thought it was really nice to see Alex Newport from Fudge Tunnel. I mean, Fudge Tunnel, I loved that band growing up in the 90s.
Again, I'm not familiar with them. I mean, it's so long ago now that I can't remember every band. I mean, I probably saw them mentioned in Kerrang or whatever, but, unless it was a band I was familiar with and was interested in reading about or knew about, I would probably just skip over that article.
Well, again, because, I mean, Fudge Tunnel they were more... They were on Earache, so they were kind of linked closer to bands like Napalm Death and Godflesh and all the bands that were on Earache around that time, and their early sound was more grindy, it was heavier. Is it Grey that's featured on the documentary? I haven't listened to them for quite a long time now, but that is kind of, I think that was the album that they started to get this, as they mentioned in the documentary, they started to be kind of compared to Nirvana. And you're like, but it doesn't sound anything like Nirvana. But you can kind of see maybe why they were trying to put them in that trap, and that was quite interesting. I think the thing with this documentary is if you know this music, you'll probably like it and you'll go with it, because it's interesting being taken back to that time and listening to all that music. And maybe for someone like yourself, if you were into a certain part of that scene but you hadn't heard it all and you want to hear some more things. Obviously nowadays it's so much easier to go on Spotify and listen to all this music. And in fact, if you go onto the website of this film or of this documentary, there has a page on there that features all the artists that they've spoken to, and then another, like, all the artists that were mentioned, and then it kind of says, it kind of recommends songs and albums from those bands, which is quite cool. Although oddly they do mention Nirvana, but Nirvana's not in that list, so I don't. I mean, I also think, obviously, I don't know who Shaun Katz is. He's Australian. He was born in, I think, 1983. It said on IMDb, so he would have been. He's slightly younger than us, but he probably, listened to this kind of music in the 90s, late 90s maybe. So it's clearly a passion project for him. He clearly loves the bands that are featured on the documentary, whereas some people won't. It's one of those things. It's all subjective, really. I was very surprised that they didn't, apart from talking to Matt Wallace, they didn't mention Faith No More at all. And they were like, to me, they were kind of they were alternative rock music to me. They were like the one alternative rock band that came out of the 90s. And to not even mention them, I thought, I mean, to me, it would have been more sense to kind of have Faith No More as the jumping off point than Nirvana. If you're not going to go to the grunge scene, go with Faith No More, because they
I would say a lot
of
the bands featured have more in common with Faith No More than Nirvana.
I think so, definitely. Yeah, I mean, they did mention Mr. Bungle slightly. Of course, that was Mike Patton's band. Yeah, so I think if you're a fan of this music, then you'll get something out of it, and I would recommend giving it a watch. I don't think it was as strong as Hype. It's a different kind of film. It's going for a different vibe.
I mean, I think it clearly sounds like I enjoyed it more than you did. I mean, I watched it twice. I watched it again, earlier today, because I watched it a few days ago and I just wanted to refresh my mind of it. And I only intended to sort of skip through it and just pick out some of the band names, because I couldn't remember all of them. But I ended up just sitting and watching the whole thing again, because I found it really well paced and engaging, and it had a sort of, I think, you mentioned you thought it was a bit disjointed, but I felt it had a through line where it had a good start and a middle and an end, and it went from the origins of the sound, and these bands, how they had no money and they just got in a van and just toured around, and they take their records and take them around the place, and they spend hardly anything making the records, and then obviously that sound becomes popular and they get picked up and offer these big deals, and then it follows on into the fall of that, and the different experiences they had with the labels and stories they heard about other bands. It's like the Monster Magnet guys. They said they were on tour with another band, and they got to a new city. Where's the other band got? Oh, they got dropped by their label and they went home. So and you feel really bad. There's a lot of stories like that, I think, where it just didn't work out, and the label, I mean, again, the labels are made out to be the bad guys for a lot of the runtime, but at the end, they do say that it's not. I can't remember who says it, but you're involved in your own destiny as well. It's not, you can't put all the blame on the label. There are some positives said at the end. That these bands did tour. They did go on these massive tours, and they got to hang around with like-minded people, and and played their music to people who would then go off and make their own music and create their own bands. Even if it didn't last for long, they still had a great time while they were doing it, for the most part.
Yeah, and I didn't dislike it at all. I kind of went with it and I enjoyed it, and I think again it's kind of, I mean, I grew up immersed in this sound.
Yeah. And maybe it's because it's not really telling you anything that you don't already know.
I think that's maybe it. Perhaps I was looking for something else. Plus, I do think that the title is a little bit misleading, because, like we said, I think alternative rock covers so much. I think there was something else quite interesting, because obviously, we think that this documentary has been being made for quite a few years. I mean, it was shown to a few festivals, I think, in 2019, which is now 2 years ago. What's actually quite interesting, they start talking near the end of it. They talk about how, obviously, a lot of these bands carried on playing. They maybe got dropped, or they carried on releasing their own records. There were a few bands talking about, I think it was Clutch. They were talking to Clutch. They would never see any of the money they made when they were on Atlantic, but now they can release their own records and they can make a living off of it. Maybe they won't make huge money, but he can make enough to just play music as a living. Exactly. But then since then, obviously, they start talking about how now we live in a different world with the internet, and they make a lot of money off the back of live shows. But what's really interesting is now that's gone, because of course we're living in this COVID-19 world. and gigs have completely stopped, and now they're having to get by again. They're having to kind of reinvent themselves again online, and there's been bands playing like gigs online and stuff like that. So I think it's interesting that it's being released now, but obviously that's not mentioned in there because it was made before COVID happened. But I thought that
it must be really difficult for bands at the moment, and particularly smaller ones who aren't signed to major labels and have big deals backing them up and things like that. I mean, I mentioned TerraVision earlier, and they're selling merchandise through Facebook to pay for studio time, so they can get in and record some new stuff. I bought a signed poster for 15 quid a few weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
It's now up on the wall in the kitchen. So, I'm well happy with it. So yeah, they've got to be creative at the moment to sort of to bring that cash in, because it's tough for that kind of industry at the moment.
So this is being released.
Yeah, video on demand, yeah. So I think it's going to be on Amazon and places like that. 23rd of March is when it's available. Yeah, so just look at your favourite streaming provider and see if they've got it. If you've got any sort of interest in music, any sort of music, check it out, because the central story is universal. Having a certain sound that's popular at that moment. The studio, the labels are always looking for, as soon as something hits it big, they're always looking for something that sounds similar to sort of replicate that, which is unfortunately. It then saturates the market, and inevitably a lot of the these bands or artists have a very brief bit of fame and then they disappear because the label drops them, and that's it. They have to then struggle to survive without that support again, when some of them can and some of them can't. So, but yeah, it's not a tale that's exclusive to this genre. It happens over and over again, unfortunately. If you are interested in these bands and you're not overly familiar with them, then I've created a playlist, and I've put loads of videos from YouTube from all the bands that that are featured in this documentary, and a few others as well, which I thought maybe should be or are similar. Things like Ugly Kid Joe and Wool, and who else? Caius, who I mentioned earlier. Green Jelly. There was can't get much more alternative.
There was one band in the 90s, and it was one band that I would love for them to be in this. They weren't in this documentary, and they were called Mother's Day Out, and they only released one album, and it's an incredible alt rock album. It's a little bit. It's kind of maybe rooted in the Seattle sound a little bit, although I don't think they were from Seattle. They had a song on the Mortal Kombat soundtrack. Back in 1995, so that's possibly where I heard them the first time. It's a great record, and it's like no one talks about it, no one knows it. I mean, obviously a lot of these bands are American, so if we didn't hear about them, I mean, yes, I was reading Kerrang and Metal Hammer, and Terrorizer was another one I was reading, so I was getting a lot of, both from work and the magazines, I was getting all this music from. But yeah, so check out Mother's Day Out, put that on the playlist.
I mean, talking about soundtracks, obviously, we've covered the film. I'm sure we've mentioned it in other videos as well. The Crow soundtrack, that's like the ultimate sort of alternative rock soundtrack. You've got Helmet on there, and My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, and Rage Against the Machine, and Stone Temple Pilots. It's just, wall to wall alt rock. If you're a fan of that soundtrack, then yeah, you are an alternative rock fan. So you definitely get something out of this documentary, I think.
So that was Underground Inc. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, let us know in the comments below.
Hit the subscribe button over there. Don't forget to push the bell for notifications. Check out the playlist that I mentioned earlier over here. And come and find us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And join us again soon for another video.